In November 2023, Zix Books launched Oops, Pubertatea, the Romanian edition of This Is So Awkward, Modern Puberty Explained. We have to say that this is the first translated version of the book. The Romanian launch was synchronized with the US launch. Inspired by the appearance of the book in the States, Zix Books organized 3 workshops in schools around Bucharest with over 100 parents and teachers, and there was this one question that kept coming. We will find out what this is together with our guests, the writers of this book. I will welcome right now Dr. Cara Natterson, pediatrician, and Vanessa Kroll Bennett, puberty educator and podcaster, the writers of this book. Hello.
Hi.
Nice to meet you, ladies.
We're so glad to be here.
We are also happy and also proud because the first version translated of your book was done in Romanian. So you're on the Romanian market thanks to Zix Books.
When we got the request, we were like, this is very exciting and unexpected. We were not anticipating the first translation to be in Romania, and we're so thrilled. It speaks highly of Romania that they take the issue of puberty and the stage of life so as seriously as we do. It's our fellow believers in talking about puberty and adolescence.
I'm very curious where the idea of writing this book came up.
Yeah, so, my background is as a pediatrician. Vanessa's background started in sports. She created a company that empowered girls to stay in sports. And what she realized very quickly was that those kids were also in puberty much younger than expected, which is how she got into puberty education. And we connected, fell in love as colleagues, and started podcasting, started building a company that was all about making puberty a more comfortable experience. And the natural next step was to write a book that contained a lot of the foundational ideas behind what we do all day.
A book that should be owned by any parent who is raising an adolescent, if you ask me, because this is the feeling that I had after reading your book. For those who might still not know, what is puberty? And why is puberty different now than it was for some other generations?
So technically, puberty is the path to sexual maturity, right? You're not able to participate in making a baby, and when you're sexually mature, you are able to participate in making a baby. That's the narrow definition. But the definition that we believe in and use in the book, and frankly that society believes in, is that it's all of the downstream effects of the sex hormones circulating in a person's body to make them sexually mature. But those sex hormones have impacts on their moods, on their brain development and decision making, on their family relationships, on their social relationships, on all sorts of choices that they make throughout this nearly decade of puberty. And that's the second part, which is that puberty these days starts on average 2 to 3 years earlier than it did when we were all going through it. It's now on average between 8 and 9 for girls and between 9 and 10 for boys. But it doesn't go faster, it actually goes slower. And so instead of a 3 to 4 year process, it's now closer to a decade of puberty.
So it lasts longer also for kids, but also for the parents.
Oh, yeah.
I'm very curious if puberty is different for girls than it is for boys, or if it's different, the parenting styles and the way that we choose to talk to our adolescents.
Obviously, there are a few differences depending upon what body parts you have. So to say that it's the same for the different genders is an oversimplification, but what we know is that the process of transforming from a child's body to a child's adult from a child's body to an adult body, and the process of transforming from a child's brain to an adult's brain, that transformation does not really change based on your gender, right? It's all of the aches and pains and joys and shifts are happening to all bodies and all brains independent of gender. They happen differently, and they happen differently within the gender. So females experience puberty in different ways from one another, and males experience puberty in different ways from one another. But very interestingly, the majority of what kids are going through is shared, right? It's all about transforming and growing and changing. Parenting styles definitely matter, right? How parents navigate definitely matters. So do personalities and temperaments and attitudes, but also circumstances, right? So the economics of what's going on in a family, the stability of a family, the stressors faced by a family. So it's both very universal, everyone goes through a similar transformation, and extremely individual.
So puberty starts earlier, it lasts longer. It doesn't really look like it was on in our age, yes. There is this thing that I face, for example, kids nowadays or adolescents at 13, 14, that they look like adults, while they don't think and they don't express like adults. How do we stop from making this thing of talking to them like they're grown-ups, when in fact they're kids in big bodies?
This is one of the biggest challenges as it relates to earlier puberty in the modern era, and the incongruity between how a kid looks versus the age they actually are, right? So an 11-year-old who looks 14, they may appear to be able to make decisions that a 14-year-old would make or a 15-year-old make. They may seem like they can socialize in a way that a 14-year-old could, but they're still 11. They're still cognitively 11. They're still socially 11. They're still emotionally 11. And so it's really on the adults in their lives to help them be 11 and to place the expectations on them that we would place on an 11-year-old. And that's hard. It's really hard to look at a person and think, oh, you're much older, when they're not. And it takes practice, and it takes time, and it takes reminders, because what we do know is that it's actually unsafe emotionally and physically if we treat kids older than they actually are.
But how do we talk to them on their language? This is the question.
So one of the things that's really important is to acknowledge that people in the world may treat them older than they actually are. And the best way into that conversation is to find out if they've noticed that rather than our just telling. So for example, it could be something like, hey, have you noticed that when we go to a restaurant, the waiter assumes you're older than you are and offers you a cocktail menu? Or have you noticed when you walk down the street that maybe some adults will look at you and talk to you assuming that you're older, right? You want to gauge what they're picking up on and what they're noticing before we start to give them advice. And once we get a sense of where the starting point is, the advice can be something like, hey, it can be hard to let adults know that actually you're younger than they think you are. So let's come up with some things you can say and some things you can do to remind adults that actually you're not 15, you're 11. What are some words that you would feel comfortable using to remind a teacher, a relative, a family friend, that actually you're still a younger kid? And again, getting the language that a kid would feel comfortable using, getting language that feels authentic to them, rather than our dictating to them what language they should use, means it's more likely they're actually going to use that language and put it into practice to remind folks, hey, I'm still a little kid, even if I look older.
It's really important to realize there are some kids who actually look younger than they are at a given age, right? So many look older than we expect, but there's a group that are late to puberty that look younger. Everything Vanessa just described is important in the opposite direction.
Is this the discussion of early bloomers and late bloomers, or not really?
It is. It's exactly right. I mean, kids will come to puberty when their bodies are ready to come to puberty. And for some kids, that happens at 8 or 9. And for some kids, that happens at 12 or 13. And if you're a 12 or 13-year-old and all of your peers look much older, they're taller, they're more developed, they seem more sophisticated, you might end up getting infantilized, right? You might end up having the adults in your life treating you like you're younger than you are. And frankly, that's very devastating for kids. So it goes in both directions, making sure that you meet kids where they are developmentally and intellectually, not as much based upon the way they present, the way they look.
I liked a lot because I felt this while reading your book, that as a parent of an adolescent, you shouldn't just pop the question right in their face. You should kind of find a way of bringing up things slowly. Is this the way that we should do it?
Well, I mean, it depends on your style, your child's style. It depends on the circumstances. If it's an emergency, if there's a health or safety issue that needs to be dealt with right then and there are going to be times when you just bluntly blurt out whatever needs to be said. But there are more effective ways into a conversation slowly and methodically that can stick with them when it's not an urgent situation, right? So everything can't be that the house is on fire and we need to quickly put out the fire. That has to be held for when it's appropriate. And most of the parenting conversations are slow, and you're towing into them, and you're going to have those conversations 15 times. And so take a moment before you rush.
I just like to say, if we go in through the side door instead of through the front door, right? So like parents, when they're worried about something or they know they want to talk about something really important, sometimes they just barge in through the front door and they're like, let's talk, let's do this right now. And they get really in a kid's face. But sometimes you want to knock on the side door and come in, take your shoes off, have a cup of tea, find out how they are, right? Like you want to do it gently and carefully. And one way to do that is not to ask, like, have you done this? Are you doing this? Have you tried this? Have you seen this? But rather keeping it broader, like, what are your friends doing? Or have you noticed this issue come up at school? Or are people talking about this, like, on the weekends, right? Rather than an interrogation method, keeping it like a little less frontal and a little more casual, we find is a more effective way into these conversations.
Thank you. Acne, extra kilos, body odors, these are themes discussed in your book. My question is, can we really talk about anything with an adolescent?
Yes. I mean, I'll start. I'm going to pass the baton to Vanessa, but whatever you choose to leave out of conversation with your child, someone else is going to have that conversation. So even with the most awkward topics, over time, if you don't cover it, someone else will. And it might be a friend who might not have very good information. It could be, in the case of sex information, it could be online porn, teaching them what you wish you could teach them. So you can talk about all of it. You just don't have to talk about all of it tomorrow, right? You have time. You can pace yourself. So Vanessa, do you want to pick up?
Yeah, I mean, the elephant in the room is a topic like porn, for example, or pornography, where it's really, really, really hard for adults to talk to kids about pornography, but we also know that it's everywhere. So research in the United States about the average age of exposure to pornography is that the average age is 12 years old in this country, and that 15% of 10-year-olds have been exposed to pornography. I don't know the data in Romania, but any community, any society where kids have access to phones and laptops and iPads and all sorts of digital devices are at real risk for exposure as children, not as mature adults, but as children. And so that's a topic where we feel really, really strongly that caregivers need to talk to kids about it. And yet it's really, really difficult. So we don't pretend that talking about any topic is going to be easy, but we do believe that it's important.
So there are no no-nos on your list. Anything can be discussed with an adolescent, but the way you bring up the subject should be, I don't know, well taken care of?
You know, I think every listener will have a different way into different conversations. If you're the adult who needs to come in knowing everything, educate yourself, right? Go make sure you've got your facts correct. Make sure you have good resources, good books. We tried to pack as much information into ours as possible to make it easy for you. Good website resources. Talk to your doctor about the best medical resources. So that's an adult who wants to come armed with the facts. There are some adults who would rather come into the conversation and get a sense of what their kids need to know. And then they leave the conversation and go look things up and come back and circle back with the kid. There's no right way to do it. There are going to be plenty of times where you get caught being asked a question you do not expect. Okay. You can say, I don't know the answer, or thank you so much for asking me. I need to go do some reading, or we can educate ourselves together. The problem is that some parents and adults in kids' lives will go do the research with the kids sitting right next to them, and they won't necessarily do the research in the right way. You know what I mean? They'll limit the way that they search or what they're looking at. So take a minute. It's okay. Usually the answer does not have to come in 30 seconds. Here's the other thing that's really powerful. You don't have to know everything. You don't. You are fully entitled to say, I don't know. Let's ask someone who does. And that might be a healthcare provider. It might be a mental health care provider, a therapist or a psychiatrist or a psychologist. It might be a school counselor. There are a lot of people who have a lot of expert advice to offer parents with kids in this age range. And we don't have to know everything about everything.
There is this one thing I was reading in your book, and it was saying that as an adult, you should not put your life stories or your own experience into the kid's experience or into what he's experimenting at that moment. Why and how do we do this?
So we like to say that adults need to leave their own baggage at the door. And we mean that metaphorically, obviously, but when we think about our memories in puberty and adolescence, it weighs on us, right? It's heavy. We can recall exactly what happened that day when we were 12 or 13 or 14, and it stays with us throughout our lives. So it is like heavy baggage, literally like a suitcase that you carry with you. But when we think about the kids we're caring for, they're working really hard to go on their own journey. They're tired. They feel burdened. They feel worried or confused or exhilarated. And we don't want to add our burden to what they already have to carry. So really often we hear from parents, well, what can I tell my kid? What stories can I share? I want them to feel connected to me. And our best advice is that we share stories that are funny, that are joyful, that show us as resilient human beings who've gotten through difficult times and come out the other side. But the really like heartbreaking kind of sob stories, those we want to share with our own trusted adults, a friend, a partner, a therapist, but we don't want to burden our kids with those stories.
So leave your baggage at the door. This is something we should keep in mind as parents. Calm down, don't cry, it's not a big deal. Why someone should never tell this to their adolescent?
Well, before we answer, I want to ask you a question. Tell us about those phrases in Romania. Are they commonly used, and what is the reaction that you've seen?
Yes, one common thing that you always hear, it will pass until you get married. So it's okay. It hurts now, but until you get married, it will be okay.
Wow, I have not heard that one.
We have a lot in Romania.
So I would say for us here in the US, when a parent says to a child, when any adult says to a child, calm down, and that child is not calm, it does not help, right? And I would imagine that's fairly universal. When a child is crying and you say, stop crying, even if they can, it's not really the solution you're going for. So when we talk about why to avoid some of these phrases, really what we're saying is when a child is stressed, when their stress level and their mood level is high, when they are, on a scale of 1 to 10, when they're at an 11, you need to calm them down and bring them down. That's part of the job of keeping them safe and healthy. And in order to do that, telling them not to feel the way they feel or to react the way they're reacting doesn't tend to work very well. So our advice is that parents help co-regulate their kids. And a teacher can do this at the front of a classroom. A doctor can do this. A therapist can do this. You just take a breath. You don't tell them to take a breath, but you take a breath. And by taking a breath, you're modeling how to calm yourself down. You're saying to them, we have a minute. Let's just pause for a second, but you're not using any words.
Why are adolescents moody? And do we explain their moods?
Great question. So the sex hormones that cause puberty to start and keep puberty going throughout this long, beautiful, messy decade and beyond, those sex hormones rise and fall in really high peaks and really low troughs. So it's like they're literally on a hormonal roller coaster. Eventually, two things will happen. The rises and falls will become less dramatic of the hormones in their bodies, and kids will get better as they get older in managing and recognizing the mood swings. But until those two things happen, their moods can be unpredictable. They can feel shameful. They can feel embarrassing. They can feel out of control. So 100% yes, we talk to them about what's happening in their bodies, because any part of this journey, explaining to kids the science makes them realize they're not the only ones, because sometimes they really do feel like they're the only ones. It makes them realize they're not totally in control of what's happening. It makes them realize that they're not a bad person, that they shouldn't be ashamed, that this is just part of a really messy stage of life. And that way they can give themselves some grace and say, oh, okay, like I'm a work in progress. I can't totally help it. I'm not a bad person, but I might need some help getting some control and managing how I'm feeling. So absolutely talk to them about it, absolutely normalize it, and absolutely help them with strategies to manage the moods, which really don't feel so good.
Okay, but how do we do as parents when we have this thing? We explain one problem 99 times, and by tomorrow, the explanation will be forgotten. How do we do it?
I mean, I'm so glad to hear that is just not only in my home and not only in my state or in my country, and that it's universal, because it's so frustrating, right? It's so frustrating. you can explain, you can ask 100 times for them to do something. You can explain the reason why something is happening 100 times. I know it feels like they don't hear us. They do.
They do.
Most of the time, they're choosing not to listen, or they're choosing not to do the thing that we're doing. And so, as the adult in their life, I think it's very important for us to explain the priority, the things that we're asking them to do that are not really choices for them, but are what we would call must-dos, right? They're may-dos and must-dos. And the must-dos are the things that you really, as the adult in their life, feel they must do. And it's not negotiable anymore. But remember, their job as a kid is to test us and to push back against our limits. That is their job. They're very good at their job. Our job is to keep them safe and healthy, and we do that by setting rules and limits. So there's an inherent conflict, and they will test and they will push. And one of the ways they test is to not do the thing we're asking or not listen to the advice we are giving. And we, as the adults in their lives, have to weigh when it's okay for them to push against that limit and when we have to implement consequences or when their safety is at risk.
And a way of testing is also this way of making bad choices. What do you feel? Do we give them the chance to experiment bad choices, or we try to protect them?
So, you know how I talked about their works in progress? I will let Cara explain the science of brain development in kids this age, because it's really important to understand. But they cannot always help it when they make bad choices. It's not necessarily volitional. Their brains are literally under construction. They are like bumpy dirt roads that will someday turn into super highways with beautifully paved roads. But right now, there's something in between. And that causes them to make not great decisions sometimes. And as parents, it's infuriating because, as you said, we might tell them something 1,000,000 times and they still don't seem like they're listening, or they still don't appear to follow our advice. Our best guidance is to remind adults, this is a long journey. Don't lose heart. Don't assume they can't hear you. They can hear you. It just takes time for them to put on board and to build the muscle memory of making good decisions. And it requires a lot of practice and a lot of conversation with the adults in their lives over many, many years. I'm not saying it's fun. I'm not saying it's easy, but it is worth continuing to do it.
But how do we manage to listen without not lecturing them? How do we do this?
Oh, it is so hard. I don't manage to do that most of the time, right? And I do this for a living. We're constantly trying to be better at being adults in their lives. How do you do it? If you can just remind yourself that sitting in silence allows them to think about things, to process things, and to share with you, then it gives you the courage as the adult to sit in silence. And as soon as you sit in silence, what you'll find is they will eventually come out of their shell and start talking. Now, for some kids, it's 2 minutes, and for some kids, it's 2 weeks, okay? And for some kids, it's 2 months. It doesn't always happen quickly, and for the kids who really are fine sitting in silence with their parents, those parents can lose their patience with this strategy. But at the end of the day, if you're lecturing them constantly, it's not going to work. So you've got to pivot your strategy anyhow. And by getting comfortable with saying the one sentence you need to say, and then showing the kids in your lives that you're willing to sit there and be quiet and wait for them to say something, they will eventually say something.
What do you think is puberty, something that we live all together, parents and kids at the same time?
Well, on our book tour, the thing that we live all at the same time is there were many, many women in menopause or perimenopause whose kids were in puberty. So everyone in the household was like on a hormonal journey, and sometimes they're on the same roller coaster. Sometimes they're on roller coasters that seem to be intersecting with each other. One of the biggest questions we got when we spoke all over the United States was, how do I handle my mood swings in relationship to my kids' mood swings when everybody feels like the house is on fire? And it goes back to the conversation about how we handle kids' mood swings. We have to take the advice for ourselves if we're also in a stage of life where moods are very up and very down and unpredictable and uncomfortable. So that was a big one that came up in terms of like everyone in the house is dealing with it.
I'm curious to hear in simple lines. This is a question for the both of you. How do we help our kids to go easier through puberty?
Yeah. I think if there was a magic answer to that and we could bottle that answer, we would make a lot of people very, very happy. And if we could charge for it, we would be very rich people because it's what everyone wants to know. And unfortunately, there isn't a simple answer through. This is a process of transformation: body, brain, emotional, social, relational, and there are going to be bumps in that road, and it is going to be hard. Our best advice is to be there to support the kids in your life, keep them safe, keep them healthy, but let them not only experience some of the lows and help you manage them through some of the lows, but let them experience the joys. If we come to it with a negative attitude and we think it's going to be horrible for a decade, that sets a tone that's not helpful, and it casts a shadow on all of this where a shadow doesn't need to be cast. If we approach it as a joke or as silly or as not that big a deal, we're minimizing some of the transformations that they are challenged by. So I'm picturing in my mind, a person, a gigantic sort of stuffed animal or a big pillow. And when a kid needs to fall back into the arms of that giant stuffed animal or pillow, it's there to support them. That's essentially how adults can support kids through puberty. But the biggest mistake we can make is to minimize what they're going through and to say, it's no big deal. It doesn't matter. It's all going to be fine. This is how it's going to work out. Those are pieces of advice that they suggest you know something that you don't. You don't know how it's going to work out. You don't know what their body's going to look like at the end of it. You don't know what their emotional challenges are going to be. So that's why you don't want to poo-poo it. You don't want to minimize, but you don't need to catastrophize either.
And be present. Thank you, Cara. What about you, Vanessa? What's your opinion?
I think the role of taking a do-over is the most important thing that any of us can learn from this stage of life. The kids going through it and the adults caring for them. And I don't know if there's a special Romanian phrase for taking a do-over, but essentially the idea is when you mess up, which you will, you go back, you apologize, you own your mistake, and you ask for another chance. And that may be when you have a kid who's having a terrible mood swing and is screaming in your face, and instead of helping them calm down, as Cara said, and co-regulating, you scream back in their face, right? And then a few minutes later, you realize, oh, I'm the adult. I'm supposed to be loving and supporting and calming them. And then you go back and you say, I am so sorry. You needed my help. You needed me to support you, and I flipped out. Can I have another chance? And part of what that does is it models for kids what they can do when they mess up, right? Because we just talked about how they're going to mess up a lot. And if they feel like they have to hide it, they need to be ashamed of it, they need to lie about it, that just makes things really hard down the road. But if they know they can own their mistakes and they can say, I made a bad decision, or I didn't handle this well, or I treated someone unkindly, whatever the case may be, then they know, oh, I live in a family, I live in a community where people admit they've made a mistake and they take responsibility for it and they get another chance. And that feels to me like the best way to help kids go through this stage of life with a little more comfort and a little more confidence than maybe they would have.
Thank you, ladies. What about mental health? Many adolescents nowadays tend to diagnose themselves because there are a lot on social media, so they might mistaken their moods, for example, sadness with depression. How do we explain and how do we make the difference between these things?
You know, it's a great way to frame the question, because you're right. Kids are self-educating in a lot of different ways, and one of the ways is to try to find a diagnosis, or they see a piece of content on social media and they've never really thought about themselves as fitting a diagnosis, and then they say, that's me, right? When I went to medical school, oh my gosh, every single disease I learned about, I thought, oh, I have that disease. Oh, I have that disease. This is a very human instinct to do this. So the fact that our teenagers do it and they do it on social media is very reasonable in many ways, right? But it's not helpful. So the way to do it is the following. First of all, kids should be educated about mental health issues. There are really significant mental health challenges facing kids all over the world right now, and it is very understandable. We just came out of a pandemic. We have all sorts of stressors in our world that were here before the pandemic that have only grown since the pandemic. And then, of course, in their individual lives, they feel a tremendous amount of stress and pressure. And that same social media that is teaching them about mental health is also delivering all of this stressful information all the time. By the way, it's also delivering a lot of joy, a lot of fun, a lot of community. So we can't demonize social media entirely, but it definitely contributes to the problem. And so kids should educate themselves appropriately and properly about mental health. They can read the mental health chapter in our book. There are great websites that we reference, that physicians can reference, and mental health care providers can reference for kids to educate themselves. But if they're worried, and if you're worried, they should be assessed. They should see someone who knows how to do a mental health assessment, and they should be diagnosed or not by someone who does this for a living.
We were talking about social media. Who wins in the battle against devices, ladies?
Well, nobody wins, but there can be a lot of losers. What are the upsides? The upsides are social media allows kids to socialize and connect with other kids in their community or around the world, right? If they have special interests or have particular passions, social media is a great place for them. On the flip side, we know that kids, if they spend too much time on screens, it can affect their mental health, it can affect their body image, it can affect negatively their sleep, it can detract from their physical activity and exercise. So we know we need to get limits in place, but I like to say that creating limits on social media for teenagers is a lot like sleep training babies. It feels like it never ends, right? Every day you're making sure the limits are set. Every day you make sure that the limits are held to. It feels like a constant battle, and it kind of never ends. So for those people out there who are feeling fed up and frustrated, trust me, I'm right there with you. But I do think it's really, really critical for kids' sleep, for their well-being, for their body image, to get limits in place. And one way to do that is actually to ask kids, like, what do you think is a fair limit? How much time do you think you should be allowed on a screen during the week or on the weekends? Should there be special circumstances? When you're FaceTiming your grandparents, that's different than when you're sitting on TikTok. So how do we differentiate between different kinds of screen time? And also, what are we modeling for our kids in terms of our own screen time? Like, do we have our phones out at the dinner table? Are we up late scrolling through our Instagram feed instead of going to sleep? Are we texting when our kids are trying to talk to us and have an important conversation? So, owning our own role and how we're modeling our use of technology and social media is a really important part of this ongoing conversation about tech and social media.
Vanessa, Cara, I also read in your book about the importance of sleeping when you have an adolescent. I was curious if you can tell to the people watching us how many hours per night should an adolescent sleep compared to a baby or to a grown-up?
Sure. So infants need anywhere from 14 to 16 hours of sleep in a 24-hour cycle. And as kids get older, their sleep needs go down. So by the time they go to school, they need about 12 hours. By the time that they are tweens and teens, those sleep needs start to drop again. But there are some kids who need more than what's recommended. So let me be very clear that these are not firm, you have to. These are just general recommendations and rules. On the other side, there are some kids who can't get the sleep they need. And they try, and it creates a lot of stress for them when after 8 hours or 9 hours they wake up. But my rule about how to look at the data is that when they're in the primary years in school, before they hit the age of 13 or 14, the goal should be about 10 hours of sleep a night. When they're teenagers, they still need somewhere between 8 and 10 hours. But it's very hard for them to get it. And it's hard for them to get it in part because they have a lot going on in their lives, and in part because the hormone that helps them wind down for sleep, which is called melatonin, is delayed in their brain. So instead of starting to rise early in the night and helping them feel tired, melatonin doesn't rise until later in the night in the teenage years, which means teenagers are actually less tired than younger kids or than adults until later in the evening. And this complicates the picture. But if you're looking for the actual data-driven answer, kids all the way through high school, all the way until they leave your nest, need somewhere between 8 and 10 hours of sleep.
Going back to social media, I would like to ask you, how do we explain to our adolescents the importance of showing up on social media? They create accounts. How do you explain to have a good image on social media, to promote what's good also?
Yeah, I mean, it's so complicated because what might seem good to us and like appropriate to us could be very different than what they deem to be good or cool or compelling or interesting or reflective of them as human beings. And this is a place where it's really critical to find out from kids rather than just place our judgment and our lens on social media. So one trend that I find really interesting right now is that a lot of teenagers post pictures of themselves that are like a little blurry, and like their eyes are closed or their mouth is open. Like it's not a perfectly curated, beautiful photo of them. It's like a little messy. And I'm interested in it because we think of social media as perfectly curated and photoshopped. And we know that kids spend a lot of time deciding what photos they're going to post on social media. And so I asked a bunch of teenagers I know, like, what's with the eyes closed and the blurry pictures and the mouth open, right? Where people don't look quote unquote perfect or beautiful. And they talk a lot about wanting to present themselves as authentic, as their true selves, as not trying too hard. So there is a natural backlash. We think of kids as only wanting to like be photoshopped and in the perfect photograph on social media. But I think there's a real pushback from kids that how they present themselves online, they want it to feel more authentic. and funnier and sillier and a little bit edgier. And it's tempting as adults to judge that, but it's actually, I think, more constructive to get curious and to ask them about the choices they're making, the photos or videos they're posting, the comments they put underneath their friends' photos. Like, if there's a whole culture of how they choose to comment and what they choose to say and how often they choose to comment. So those are really good conversations to have with kids, and to really leave your judgment behind and just get curious and ask them what's going on in their mind when they do this stuff.
Let's talk about sex, ladies. How do we do this?
Oh, well, again, you're not going to be surprised by this answer. It's going to happen differently in every home. It depends on the parents and their approach and their personality and their knowledge, and it also depends on the kids and, of course, the age and all of the other circumstances. We have in the book about, I don't know, I don't want to say 1 million because it's not 1 million, but it's 100 different ways into the conversation at all different levels with all different types of information. It's going to look differently depending upon you and the child you're dealing with. In fact, even with 2 different kids in the same home, the conversation is going to look different. The most important thing is that you come to the conversation with no judgment, no shame, right? And good information. So since you asked, we can tell the audience, you will 100% get asked questions about sex, probably about your own sexual history. And also, while we're talking about awkward conversations, you're probably going to get asked about your drug history at some point as well. Know that. Think about what you want to say. You're entitled to give whatever answer you want. Our advice is never lie. You don't have to share everything. You can say, I don't want to share everything right now, but just be prepared. And when it comes to explaining sex, Vanessa, do you want to take it from here?
So one of the things that comes up a lot is, what if my kid wants to know exactly what I did and how I did it and how old I was and did I like it and who was it with, right? Like, kids, as they're figuring out their own journey, ask us a lot of really personal questions. And what I want to make sure adults realize is it's your right to keep some things private and not to share everything, while also saying to you, again, there's nothing shameful about this. This is natural and normal, but like, that was my journey and I'm going to choose to keep it private, but I will talk to anything you want. And we'll engage with it, and I am here for you, but I'm not going to spill my entire life story because that's not appropriate. So I just want to reassure people that they can keep some stuff private. The other thing that we like to talk about with sex is, like, there's all different kinds of sex. People have lots of different kinds of sex. Even though we grew up with one definition of sex, there's a lot of different ways people choose to have sex with each other or by themselves. And being inclusive of that as we have conversations with kids. I like to describe conversations with kids about sex like a spiral, and it becomes increasingly sophisticated with age-appropriate information as they grow older. So you don't back up the dump truck and give them all the information at once. Bit by bit, you give them pieces of information over time that they're capable of handling and understanding.
Vanessa, you just read my mind because I wanted to ask you ladies, how do we master inclusivity and how do we keep a speech, yes, that doesn't hurt them and that does not offend their choices?
Yeah, I think it's exactly the way Vanessa framed it, which is you don't know who your child is going to be as an adult. You don't know who they're going to love. You don't know what their desires are going to be. So if you keep that in the front of your mind, then you can enter a conversation in an inclusive way. And if you notice that your definitions or your explanations are narrow and limited, you can say, this is one way, or this is the way I'm most familiar with, or this is the experience I've had, but acknowledge that there are other experiences. Again, if your goal is for your child or the child in your life to come to you as a resource on an ongoing basis, then to pretend that limited information is enough is really not gonna translate there. So be inclusive by starting with, this is one way, or I don't have all the answers, but here's one answer, and then go from there.
Dr. Cara, you just finished your US tour. I'm curious, how was the book welcomed, and when we will see a European tour also?
Oh, we are so hungry to come to Europe. We would love it. So, anyone out there who wants us to come visit, let us know, contact us, and we would love to be in conversation. The US tour was amazing. We were welcomed by 36 different school settings. We spoke to 55 school communities. We spoke to businesses. We have been on, I don't know how many podcasts. We've done lots of TV. I mean, it was the best because we could get the message out and we could be in conversation with so many people around the country, not just adults, by the way, a lot of tweens and teens sharing experiences. So we loved it, and we would love to do it abroad.
We can't wait to have you here in Europe also. At the beginning, I was telling you that Zix Books organized 3 workshops in schools around Bucharest with over 100 parents and teachers. And there was this one question that kept coming. What to do when the things taught at home are the opposite from what your colleagues ask you to do? How do you keep your coolness when you don't want to disappoint neither your colleagues or your family as an adolescent?
Yeah. So that question applies to both the kids and the adults. So every household is going to do things differently. Schools are going to do things differently. Workplaces organize ideas differently. Our expectations of what is typical or expected is going to be different in different settings. So the first thing to do is leave your judgment aside. It's not your job to judge how other people do it, and it's not their job to judge how you do it. The second is, if you are an outlier, if everyone else seems to be doing something one way and you are doing it a different way, it would be helpful to reflect on, okay, why? What's my explanation internally to myself about why I want to do things this way? And then talk to your kid about it. Because if you feel like you're a little bit alone in the experience, then the child in your life is also going to feel that way. And if you're really passionate about the choice you're making, you can always explain to a kid why.
Dr. Cara, my last question would be, do you think you practice what you preach?
Oh, this is the best way to end, because Vanessa and I talk all the time about how we are learning as we go. We mess it up every day. We try. So much of the book was written from our heart, based on experiences that we've had in our own homes and in our own work life. But we're also making mistakes every day in every way. We are not shy about admitting that. And as Vanessa said earlier, our favorite piece of advice is to take a do-over, and we do that every day. So we practice what we preach there. We definitely take do-overs.
This is great. Dr. Cara Natterson and Vanessa Kroll Bennett, the writers of this amazing book, Pubertatea, in Romanian. Yes, it's a must-read. We find it at zixbooks.ro. Personally, I think this should be the Bible of every parent who goes with the adolescent through puberty. It was great having you today here.
Thank you so, so much.